Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Keith Martin Smith. So Keith is an ordained Zen priest. He is the author of 3 books, including one on Junpo, coming to, we've got a heart blown wide open. He is also a Northern Kung Fu master. So, for those in England, that doesn't mean he eats pie and has a whippet. That's a style of Kung Fu. He's also been a really good Facebook friend of mine for ages. We've had loads of fun on Facebook, and so it's a really good opportunity to chat. So, Keith, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to have some FaceTime with you finally.
And you're in Boulder, Colorado, right?
I am, yeah, by way of Philadelphia.
It's a dark evening here in Brighton. It looks like a bright day there.
It is a typically searingly bright, sunny, beautiful day here.
Fuck you. Okay. So how did you get interested in working with the body?
I think I started because I went through my middle school and teen years radically disembodied. So for the Enneagram wonks out there, I'm an Enneagram 5, which means I'm very heady, sort of live in my head, and I was very smart, very bookish, and really starting through puberty, really dissociated from my body. And by the time
for those who aren't in Colorado, Enneagram's a personality type system. Yeah. That's a particularly heady one. So you're disembodied, and then what happened?
Yeah, so disembodied, thinking type, and through high school, started smoking fairly heavily, drinking, drugs, the whole thing, getting arrested. And by the time I was 20, I remember going up a flight of stairs, just about 4 or 5 stairs, and I was winded when I got to the top. I was 20 years old, and it was just that moment of clarity. I realized that I was on a path that was going to kill me. And I had heard, of course, about martial arts, and this would have been in the very early 90s. And so Bruce Lee was still a bit of a cultural phenomenon. But I knew a guy growing up that had trained in Kung Fu, which is Chinese. Kung Fu is Chinese martial arts. And I had trained a little bit in karate, which is Japanese martial arts. And I was blown away by how much more powerful and under control his body was than mine when we were kids. So when I was 20 years old, I went back, found a Kung Fu school, began training, and literally never looked back.
Great. So you were the first, we've had many martial arts teachers, some karate, tai chi, aikido, but you're the first Kung Fu teacher. So maybe you could kind of lay out the territory here for those of us who are pretty ignorant of this area. What is Kung Fu? And there's kind of a whole load of styles, aren't there? It's quite hard to define, but if you could sort of lay out that territory a little bit for us.
Yeah, to keep it simple, I mean, again, karate's Japanese and Kung Fu is Chinese. Under Kung Fu is, technically it's Kung Fu pronounced, but it's any number of systems of martial arts. There's Tai Chi would fall under that, which is the more gentle, movement-oriented, breath-oriented movement discipline from China. You had the Shaolin Temples, a northern Shaolin Temple and a southern Shaolin Temple. There's a lot of mythology and bullshit around them, but they both developed systems of fighting through, starting sometime around 1000 AD, give or take. And then you have a whole bunch of other systems that came out of China, from Wing Chun to Hung Gar. And they sort of run a gamut. On the one end, the end that I'm on is really highly mobile, a lot of kicks, really intensely powerful. And then you come down to ones that were more geared for everyday people, like Hung Gar, which was sort of a farmer's martial art, more grounded, more on the ground, used more everyday weapons like farm instruments. And then you had ones like Wing Chun, which are more fighting disciplines. So there's a huge pantheon of stuff, which
China's a big place, right? And in my experience, old, big, and not the biggest fans of necessarily even organized systems. In the way that the Japanese can be a bit more rigid around things, in my experience, and the sort of Chinese, it sort of flows, and it's in families, and it's there's not maybe a northern style or a southern style, this distinction, but it is there's a kind of poeticism and fluidity to it, which for those that come from the Japanese martial arts is a kind of almost like a slightly different flavor.
Totally. There's the Kung Fu, in almost all the systems of Kung Fu, there's a really big emphasis on aesthetics. So there's an eye towards beauty. So, and when you train, you learn these elaborate forms, which look really beautiful to watch. And then your teacher will also teach you the applications, which sometimes are different than what you're doing. And part of that is aesthetics because the forms look pretty. And part of it was, if you think of this back in the day when this was essentially cutting edge military intelligence, you don't want to be practicing your stuff and have someone watching you and figuring out exactly what it is you do and how you fight. So you would hide it a little bit with artistry.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It seems to be part of the culture, the sort of Chinese, there's what you hide as well as what's obvious. And the idea of aesthetic kind of being, people won't necessarily associate martial arts with aesthetics. So they might be a little bit surprised to hear that. But and a kind of critique sometimes of Chinese martial arts, say it's flowery, that sometimes.
Yeah, and it's gotten complicated because again, I don't want to get too esoteric on this, but in the 20th century, the Chinese government really took over the Shaolin Temple, and they created something called wushu, which is basically they took modern gymnastics and combined it with traditional kung fu, made something that's really beautiful and has absolutely no application or power whatsoever. And that's a lot of what, if you were to look up kung fu on YouTube, see a lot of that stuff.
And it's kind of good for the martial arts movies because it's jumpy and flashy.
Yeah. That's exactly what it seems like.
And good if you're a dictatorial government that wants to oppress people and not have to actually give them any practical skills.
Yep.
So there's that's the wushu is the modern form, which looks beautiful but doesn't necessarily have that martial root. And was it considered a form of self-development, the kind of Japanese do kind of thing, or was it really mostly just like, right, this is practical thing?
It was really both. The history of Chinese martial arts is really interesting. It has a much more complicated history than Japan, where Japan, it was really rooted more frequently to aesthetic Buddhist practices, cultivating mindfulness.
Yeah.
It was all over the place in China. It depends on the system. It depended on the family that was teaching the system. There's a lot of evidence that martial artists weren't very well respected culturally in China. They were sort of viewed as sort of knuckle dragging, uneducated.
They're not viewed that highly in Japan, from what I can gather. It's certainly not a high class job to have.
It was not a high class at all.
Maybe
they were people you hire for protection. They ran the mafia. They enforcers. It wasn't. It'd be like training in Italian mafia techniques.
Right.
Some of the Chinese back then were like, why would you respect that? It's just a bunch of roughnecks running around hurting people.
Yeah, so it's quite different from if it's coming from a kind of in the society religious, maybe government approved kind of thing than it may have been in kind of Japanese kind of samurai society where first with the traditional arts and then later with the Budo arts, which are quite much more modern than people think. There was that personal cultivation that was central to it. And I always think of sort of Japanese arts as like sushi and Chinese arts as like a plate of noodles. It's kind of like in some ways it's richer and more delicious, but also a total mess.
Totally, yeah, because the Japanese being so homogenous and so tiny just geographically, they codified their martial arts. They created schools like we would recognize today, modern schools that had books and testing, and all the masters would get together and they codify things.
Yeah.
Chinese didn't do anything like that. It was almost all family systems where basically if you're alive and you're teaching and you're 70 years old, that's proof that you know what the fuck you're talking about. Right?
And there's something almost casual about it. As someone that's been in the Japanese martial arts and you go to a dojo and you line up in straight lines. And I remember being in Hong Kong and, just seeing like old guys in their tracksuits and sneakers, like practicing in the park really informally, maybe playing push hands with someone. And there was sort of informality and a kind of like, practice it. The Bruce Lee film where they practice after work in the Chinese restaurant. There's some truth to that sort of casualness, isn't there?
Totally, yeah. And some of your listeners might be grinding their teeth right now because I'm not mentioning the temples. But like I said before, there's mostly mythology around the Shaolin temples. There's very historically valid information on them. But it does seem that the temples offered a Buddhist path, both for martial arts practitioners and for non-fighting monks as well. So there was a culture in China where martial arts could be done as part of a deep body-mind mindfulness practice. There's some evidence of it, but
and even the myth is interesting, though, isn't it? Because the myth does say something of the founder of Chan Zen, what is Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism in
Dharma.
Yeah, but the myth itself is interesting. It says the guy who founded Zen was also the guy who founded martial arts in this kind of personal growth form. And, you know, whether that's historically true or not, that's certainly interesting as a myth.
Totally. Yeah. Yep.
Well, imagine, so you got into this and then, you know, you got heavily into it. Tell us something about that sort of development path from the kind of young guy who's breathless and just wants to kind of learn something cool maybe to, you know, where are we at 20, 25 years later?
Yeah, boy, it's, you know, I think maybe I'll tell a story about my teacher that highlights that. So I trained under a Shaolin monk who defected from the Shaolin Temple. They were here on tour as part of a troupe. And he defected in 1992 in New York City. His name is Shi Yang-ming. And I started studying under him in 1995. And so I trained a little bit with a small school near where I was going to school, and then found this guy. And I was, you know, 22 or 3, something like that. And you know, he was a real Shaolin monk. He trained at the temple since he was 5. He could do unbelievable things with his body. And I trained with him for about 6 or 7 years while I was living in New York City, and then I commuted back and forth. And it was this sort of more sport version of martial arts, a lot of gymnastics, a lot of jumping. And I had a real chip on my shoulder. You know, I was training from a real Shaolin monk. I thought I was totally the shit. And I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and a colleague of mine told me about a Shaolin master that had opened a school in this little strip mall in Philadelphia. And I'd seen over the years, I'd been trying to find a teacher closer to Philadelphia, and I looked at a bunch of schools, and they were mostly inept, incompetent, or just flat out, you know, charlatans. But
there's a lot of charlatans in that field because of the reputation and name of Shaolin, isn't there? There's a lot of kind of pretenders and bullshit out there. Yeah.
And because unlike Japan, there's no centralized system. So there's all these family systems. So someone could have a legitimate strain of teaching that came from so the only way to tell is to go talk to them and watch them, and look at their students. So anyway, so make a long story short, I go to check out the school, and I'm highly skeptical. And this would have been like the very late 90s, early 2000s. And it's in this little strip mall, you know, and I walk by an open window. I don't tell him I'm coming. And I look in the window, and he's doing a handless headstand. So his back is to me, and there's a man in there, and he's on the top of his head, and his hands are by his side, and he's completely rigid. And I thought, well, he might not know any kung fu, but he's got some serious somatic fucking skills.
Yeah, that's an advanced yoga move.
So I go in and I talk to him, and his name is Jong-hoon Jung, and he's actually Korean. He learned Shaolin Kung Fu in South Korea. And so we talked for a little bit, and he told me pretty much, you know, a little bit about himself, and he asked me to do some of my practices. And I went through and, you know, showed him maybe 4 or 5 forms that I knew. And he watched it, and he said, oh, so no one teach you breathing? And I said, what? He said, no one teach you breathing? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, oh, no breathing, you like muscle man, very easy to beat. And that sort of made me really curious about what was up with him. And so I studied with him for a month and found out that he had this powerful Qigong practice in addition to this purely physical somatic practice. And the things he could do and can do with his body were unbelievable. And that was the moment when I got really humbled and realized that I wasn't an advanced practitioner, but I was a fucking beginner at 10 years.
You know, that's normally the story of martial arts or many other things, isn't it? It's like you get pretty good, you feel like you're the shit, and then you go a little bit further and you find someone else, and it's just embarrassing, you know? Yeah. That was my story with Aikido several times and other things. Like, really? You know?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And you ended up doing Kung Fu at the Integral Center. So, you know, you're bringing in, I want to talk about, so there's this traditional approach, you know, there's forms and teachers and lineages, and, you know, we could probably swap war stories and magic practice stories and all the rest of it. Listeners might love that, but it's, you know, actually, I think in some ways what's even more interesting is you actually developed it in quite a modern context, right? Like doing it in the Integral Center, you know, for those of us who aren't in Boulder, people might not know who Ken Wilber is, for example, listening to this. Tell us about like teaching in that modern context with that broader framework rather than just the kind of traditional Asian one.
Well, I mean, I think it's the challenge of any first generation Western student. You know, you guys have seen it a lot in the UK, and there are a number of us in the US that have had to work with this, but it's, you know, you're not just teaching something that you were taught, you're having to do a cultural translation as well.
Yeah.
So I can't teach the way I was taught. I would have no students if I did. It was a very particular, very stubborn type of Westerner that was willing to train in that Eastern system, which is basically, they don't explain the rules. If you break the rules, you get thrown out or frozen out. And they'll, you know, they teach you by showing you what they can do with their bodies. It's not watch me. It's let me throw you into a fucking wall and demonstrate why I'm the master and you're the student. There's no.
Yeah, I had that kind of Aikido training in the first few years. No one breaking anything down. You know, super hierarchical, confusing, frustrating. And we had a very small Aikido club compared to other kind of, you know, I've got one good friend of mine, Marcin. He's got one Kung Fu student because he does it really like the old school ways. And it, you know, they meet in the park every day and he expects him to invest 3 hours a day in it, you know, and it's, he's got like one guy that he trains and it's, you know, he's like, you know, do you think I could start a club? I'm like, well, not training that way, you know?
Well, so here's another story, and then I'll answer the question because I think it does sort of answer it. So I was training with my teacher, Jung Hoon Jo, and I trained with him for about 8 years. So I'm at about 15 years of training now total. I'm running his school, teaching 9 classes a week. I'm fighting in tournaments, you know, highly accomplished martial artist now, deep Qigong practice. And he pulls me aside one day and he says, I want you to take all of the students, except the top 3, all of them, and go and open your own school. And I was like, geez, master, you know, my marriage is falling apart. You know, like it's not a good time. Like it's not a good time for me to start my own school. I need to focus on my life. And he said, okay. And a year later, I was out of the school.
Because you didn't.
He didn't throw me out. He froze me out. He stopped training me and he stopped talking to me. That was it.
Yeah.
And I realized about a year later, I finally reached out to him, emailed him, and apologized and said, I realized you handed me the lineage and I spit in your face. You know?
Yeah.
That was how he perceived it.
Yeah. But he's not going to tell you that necessarily as well, right? There's the sort of private and the public again. There's the sort of stuff around face and, you know, I've heard all sorts of stories like this from Japanese martial artists, Japanese Aikidoka, people get upset about an umbrella being forgotten or, you know, there's a thing once with a football shirt that was bought with different funds or, you know, like, and just the politics and the freezing out and all that kind of stuff, which is just really confusing if you don't get it. You know, I was looking after a Japanese Aikido sensei once and we took him out for dinner and we took him to the pub afterwards. And I said, look, sensei, I'm really tired from training. You know, the accommodation's just across the road. Are you okay, you know, for us to leave you here? Looked like he was having a good time with some other Aikido teachers. And it's okay if we leave you here. And he was like, oh, yeah, no problem. Yeah, so we thought, okay, sleeping across the road, he knows where he is, he's having a good time. We left, went to bed, had a good night's sleep. You know, the next day we get like a massive bollocking out from our teacher. Why did you abandon Sensei? Why did you leave him on his own? He was horribly uncomfortable. He didn't know what to do. And it was like, that just wasn't communicated. We were expected to know that, you know? As someone who's pretty blunt and explicit, that was pretty confusing.
Yep. So the way I run my school is much more traditional American or Western style, which is, you know, we have formal start and end times. We do calisthenics. We do stretching. I explain what I'm doing. I explain what the expectations are. You know, I let my senior students know where they are in the hierarchy of their training, where they can expect to be. I put everything on the table. If someone asks me a question, I answer the question. They don't always understand the answer. If it's around something more esoteric and Qigong or body awareness that's evolved in me.
But you're trying to give them a clear answer, right? I
always answer the question. I always ask. That's the difference between a Western school and an Eastern one, at least as I understand it.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to both. Like I learned to really observe well from having a teacher that didn't explain anything.
That's right. You got to watch.
But I'd say on the whole, I'm just going to go out and say it. Like I think the Western teaching method is just better.
I totally agree.
It's better.
Totally.
method. And I get these cultural differences, but I don't want to just be totally pluralist about it and just say like, there's a reason I break things down. There's a reason I don't do that. And like, it's borderline abusive, the kind of old school teacher method as well.
I agree. And more than that, I look at our school and this guy, what I've come to realize over the years, and I've met a lot of martial artists, and what made my teacher unique, one of the things was that he's a savant. Like his somatic line of development is off the charts. And so his ability to embody the practice is unlike almost anybody I've seen. And you can't teach that.
Those people are hard to learn from, the savants, aren't they? Because they gotta
watch. Yeah. So out of that whole school out of Philly, and at one point it was probably 40 or 50 people, I'm the only one that trained all the way through and became a master. And the school's gone now. He only trains me. So that just, to me, shows how ineffective that model is.
Yeah, it's not a good method, isn't it? And to some extent, I feel like, the sort of Japanese have a similar model where they train 100 people, but they only want one or two good students. And the rest are kind of A, cannon fodder, and B, they're paying the way for everyone else. And there's a whole testing procedure. So I went to an Aikido school once, and the teacher ignored me for a month, beat me up for a month, and then started teaching me. And 2 months. Maybe people have seen Fight Club, where they have to stand outside the house for 2 days and nights before they're allowed in. I mean, that's normal in Zen temples. That's directly from Zen and martial arts schools in Japan. You literally have to stand outside the door until the teacher decides to talk to you.
So you're worth it
every day, and stand out there with your umbrella, kind of hoping they kind of stop and invite you in one day. And that is traditional. That Fight Club actually stole that from martial arts and Zen as a proper. There's a lot in that film actually that's stolen from martial arts and Zen as a tradition. So let's come on to Zen. So you've got this martial arts thing, and actually, just before we do, let's finish up on that. So the modern context. So you're in teaching methods have evolved, but then there's also a much bigger picture of personal growth here. So I'm kind of integrally informed, but not everyone will be. Not everyone speaks the language. You talk about lines of development, for example. How does that kind of framework, which I still think is a fantastic framework, states, stages, lines, some of these things maybe you could explain. How does that framework inform you as a martial arts teacher?
I mean, hugely. So the central tenet, and Ken Wilber didn't invent this or wasn't the first one to see it. He just wrote about it lucidly as part of a much bigger philosophical picture. But the idea of lines of development, everybody knows that there's, for instance, a cognitive line of development, an emotional line of development, and a somatic line of development. Those are
ways to be smart, basically, right?
Yeah. You can be a math guy, you can be a Olympic guy, you can be a therapist, right? So cognition, emotional, somatic. But there's lots of lines of development. They all have sublines and all this stuff. So it's really helpful for me. It's been really helpful for me because, for one thing, when I teach, I can see that some people that have really high cognition, I'll teach them basically through their minds to get them into their bodies.
Yeah.
Some people, and if you've trained a long time in martial arts, this, like any community, some people come there because they have a lot of emotional need for community. They might have father issues, like just to be conscious and aware that line of development might be stunted or might be really active can be really helpful in teaching. And then, of course, there are people that come in that are former gymnasts or they're former dancers or they're former whatever. They're deeply in their body and they get taught in a different way as well. So I'd say as a teacher and a martial artist, those really 3 simple lenses just not teach everybody the same way.
And then there's understanding that states don't equal stages, right? So like someone could have a sort of a transcendent experience doing martial arts or Zen and anything else, and that doesn't actually change them permanently as a person. It's like you...
Not at all. Yeah, I mean, in Zen, you see this in Zen more in martial arts.
Come on to Zen, yeah.
You don't really see it in Kung Fu very much. But in Zen practice, people sit, they go on a retreat or they practice for a month and they have a really ego-shattering illumination where they really have, for the first time in their lives, a state experience, which is a temporary experience of being bigger than anything that they've ever been before. And it puts everything into a perspective that initially is usually euphoric and beautiful and powerful. And as that state experience inevitably collapses, it can become incredibly painful and confusing. And they get on the path of seeking and chasing states, which is a very dangerous path. spirituality is. You go on Facebook, everybody's selling states. Nobody's selling emptiness because there's no money in emptiness.
Yeah, and you see that, like, I'm going to go to yoga class tonight, and there's a certain kind of state buzz you can get. Like if you do a hot yoga class or a strong vinyasa class, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a state buzz. But then, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I don't want to be too critical of that, because we need to change our state. We need to, I'd say even better, learn to manage your own state rather than having to be dependent upon something for a buzz. And like that is a super, super useful life skill. But just because you keep bumping your state doesn't mean you've changed it another way. And the stages thing was the bit in integral theory that was new to me. I mean, shadow works in there too, which is, super helpful, because the Asians just don't have that. Like seeing that's a Western thing, like if you have martial arts and meditation teachers who keep like banging their students or have problems with money or power, well, that's shadow. They need therapy. They don't need meditation. Like cleaning up isn't the same as waking up, to steal someone else's phrase. And I feel like that's what another thing the West's really added to some of those traditions is the kind of cleaning up part, the therapeutic part.
No question about it. I mean, one of my favorite stories from my Zen teacher, Junpo, was that he, at 50 years old, he'd spent 6 years in the monastery with Edo Shimano Roshi, and was Shimano Roshi's first Dharma heir. He got, he got Inca. He became a Roshi in his own right, the first one in that lineage.
Inca's official transmission, yeah. So just be careful with the terminology.
Yeah. Sorry, getting wonky. Yeah, Inca's when a Zen master transmits to another Zen master. It's the formal ceremony of transmission. So Junpo Roshi received this, and he went out and he started to teach a little bit, and then he started doing all this intensive therapy. And he stopped teaching and he started seeking individual and group therapy work. And I asked him, well, what were you doing? And he said, I realized that 6 years in the fucking monastery staring at the wall, and I could transcend or get around all of my neurosis from my childhood. I could watch it arise. Yeah,
spiritual bypass, right?
I could not grab it. It would arise, and I was trained enough that I could simply let it arise and let it fall away. He said, but 6 years and deep, deep, deep stable states, deep awakening state that had stabilized in him, didn't fucking touch his trauma. Didn't touch it. So he said all those wounds were exactly the same as they were, and no amount of meditation was going to touch them. He had to go back in his words, do the small self shit.
Yeah. Yeah, the work on the self rather than the work on transcending the self, or just having that transcendent state. And I get argued with this all the time, but that is a Western thing. Like there's a little bit of it in Tibetan Buddhism, but hardly in Tibetan Buddhism. Absolutely laced with abusive teachers of various kinds. The guru system combined with a lack of shadow work, I think, is a real problem.
And a rigid patriarchy in Tibet. I mean, a real patriarchy, not the kind that we hear about.
Not a made-up Boulder patriarchy, right?
I mean, that's there's all men at the top that hold all the power, and there ain't no women at the top. Not because they're not qualified, because they're not allowed.
Yeah, it's not a democracy. There's sexism at a level which is actually really hardcore. So we talked about states of waking up and then cleaning up. And again, I'm using someone else's system here. I forget it is, but it's a nice way of explaining integral. There's also growing up. The development. This was the new thing for me in integral. And I remember it made a lot of sense. Like I was in a martial arts dojo, and it's like some people needed that rigid tradition, right way, wrong way. And some people were kind of more, traditionalists. Some people were more like modernists, and they were like, okay, but what works? Like MMA. And then right and bolder pluralists, and they're like, what? It's all about feeling and sensitivity and actually sensing your partner. And I was like, wow, these are like three different tribes of value. If we look at, let's say, a values line in development, standard kind of, I don't know, spiral dynamics. I'm being cheap and ugly with it, but like that was a kind of big realization to me as a movement teacher. And when we're in Russia, sometimes I'm going, okay, I'm trying to teach embodiment, and they want to know the right way, wrong way, because there's a blue or a level 4. There's different systems and codology, how adults continue to develop. And I was like, okay, so they're going to need it bullet points and they're going to need it by the book, but I'm not going to try that shit when I was teaching in Holland last weekend, because, it's super pluralist there. And if I tell them there's a right way to do something, they're going to get upset with me and think I'm a fascist, So do you know what I mean? So it's really helped me working cross-culturally and with different individuals and groups.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's, you can take all Wilber stuff or spiral dynamics and just really, you broke it down really simply. It's like you can think about it as people who follow rules, people who concerned about being really good achievers or really like doing it for themselves.
Yeah.
And people who are there to do it as part of like a communal context. Like that's a really simple way for me to understand.
They're the three groups you're going to come across, this below and above that, but they're the three you're going to find generally, right?
And they all think each other are wrong and fucked up. That's the other thing that happens.
They will argue with each other, right?
Them in a room together, then it can be problematic.
Yeah, yeah.
You're not getting a lot of pluralists, I would imagine.
And you see this in the the martial arts world, because like we were both educated in that traditional martial arts, stage 4 or blue meme of kind of like right way, wrong way. Really? And then it's like you go, yeah, but sensei, it's not really the best time for me right now. Logically, modernly,
I don't feel like this is a good time to receive.
Yeah. And he's like, fuck what you feel. I'm the boss, right? There's a rigid hierarchy, and even he personally, he's operating a system at that stage of development. Even he personally is somewhere else, and you see that conflict in the martial arts. And I think something like MMA, the mixed martial arts, the cage fighting, the combination of modern martial arts trying to test things and prove things, it's like a kind of evolution of the kind of modern materialist let's see what works mindset. And what gets lost sometimes is the personal growth or some of the traditional values within that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say MMA is a perfect, Inspire Dynamics Orange or
stage 5.
It's let's reject all of the cultural trappings of martial arts, all of these old masters that are cranky fuckheads, and let's just distill whatever works. And then let's get into rings and let's fight full speed, full contact. And the proof will be, this is very modern. Let's gather evidence. Well, look, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy destroys all these old traditional martial arts guys because they don't have to get on the fucking ground,
Yeah. What works, the effectiveness, and this might be a bit confusing to people listening, this idea of adult development. I know for certain people at more pluralist stages of development, it can actually be offensive. How dare you say that some people are more developed than others? There's no truth except for the fact that there's no truth, which is a contradiction. But anyway, so it's that there's also, you'll see that more in like the Californian Aikido, or imagine in Boulder and Brighton where I live, Amsterdam. I come across that as well. I see that in yoga a lot. And these can be very uneasy bedfellows. Like in yoga, you've got sort of a fascist thread, a body beautiful thread, using yoga to get what you want, and a kind of pluralist, everything's good thread. And they're all
same thing.
Weird bedfellows,
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just recommend anyone listening to look up Spiral Dynamics or Ken Wilber Adult Development or Robert Keegan. There's loads of good starting points out there on adult development, but it's really, it's opened my mind to looking at the systems I was in.
And I would just to point that out, if you're listening to this, watching this, and you don't know about human adult development, you are missing out on arguably the single most important thing you will ever learn as an adult, in my opinion. I mean,
wow, that's big. Why is it so important? I mean, I love it, but why that important?
It's revolutionary, because what we all do until we learn that human development is real and there's overwhelming evidence for it, what we all do is we assume that everybody is the same. And that conflict arises because Mark and I, we just have different opinions.
Yeah.
And so if we sit down, and maybe I want Mark to go to sensitivity training because he's an asshole, and maybe Mark wants me to go and lift some weights because I'm a pussy.
Yeah.
And we think that's the problem, but that's not the problem. The problem is actually we have different worldviews with different value systems.
Yep.
And those worldviews and those value systems are clashing, and they can't be resolved until you understand the differences between them.
People are talking at cross purposes. People just talk across purposes.
You're making the world a worse place if you don't know that.
Yeah.
You're out there creating conflict that's not necessary.
I got married again recently, and we had a sort of big wedding party in the UK because the original one was in the Ukraine, and a lot of people couldn't come. And it was really interesting. I had like tables of adult development. So I had my like conservative, sort of slightly right-wing side of the family with the military. Right. Like, terribly pleased to see you, Mark. It's lovely to be here. His present.
The blue tablecloths are for this family. The orange.
We had the liberal side of the family who were like hippies, and they all work in arts and therapy. And then we had the kind of my business friends who are out there, doing business deals and kind of, and it's like I was able to move between the tables and kind of get on with everyone. And I'd say to my, I remember one time my mom was like, I don't understand my brother. His whole life he's been in the military, and I just don't understand it. And she's coming from a very pluralist point of view. And I said, well, Mum, you can think of it as a humanitarian organization, and he's, this is how he wants to serve people. And like for the first time in her life, she got it. And she was like, oh, because from his way of speaking and his value set, it just doesn't make, he just doesn't make sense to her. And she didn't understand why we got on really well. And it was that flexibility that I could be with him and be in that embodiment, which is, that traditionalist embodiment of best of British officer class, and how I could be with her and be kind of relaxed and kind of, it's a different embodiment that's there.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Zen. So that's your other big thing. You wrote a book on this. We talked about Junpo, so I have to say like that. So I've been on a couple of Zen retreats, sessions with him, and was really impressed. He was the most yang meditation teacher I've ever met.
Yep.
Like, I'm used to my meditation teachers basically being wimpier than me. And this was the first time I had a meditation teacher that was more fierce than me. And I was just like, fucking hell, this is weird. And he also, like a lot of Zen teachers, he tells a lot of good jokes, and he's got this colorful background as a sort of drug dealer and all sorts of, the biography you wrote about him, it's just got so many great stories. And, he's really lived, this guy. And
he made it into a movie too.
He was, sorry?
It's being made into a movie.
Oh, is it? Oh, it'd be a fantastic movie.
We're in the 2 years in of development now. Yeah.
He spent time in prison. He's, but he's also, been to Japan and done the, traditional Zen thing. Why were you attracted to Junpo as a teacher?
I was attracted to him. It's in the book. But I was attracted to him. I was invited to Boulder Integral, which was an offshoot of Ken Wilber's think tank that formed here about 2006, 2007. And I was invited to a small symposium of integral leaders and thinkers.
Yeah.
And there were maybe 40 of us there. And so I got put into a quad with a Zen teacher named Diane Hamilton.
Yeah, I love her,
yeah. Yeah, and a buddy of mine named Jason, and this old white dude with a shaved head.
Jason Gaddis?
No, yeah, well, he was there, but I'm saying that the quad I was in.
Sure. I'm like, I know these people, so
yeah. So the old white guy with the shaved head.
Yeah.
So we were instructed to say who we were, why we were there, and what integral meant to us, what integral theory meant to us. So Junpo goes first. So I've never met him, no idea who he is. And he says, he's like, well, they call me Junpo these days. I'm supposed to be some kind of a Zen master. And I was like, oh, interesting. And he said, a couple years ago, I started fucking somebody that I shouldn't have been fucking, priest of my order. And I fucked up her marriage, and I fucked up my marriage, and I nearly destroyed everything I spent a lifetime building. So at 64 years of age, I had to go back and start doing this small self-therapy shit again. So I'm here to see if Integral can explain what the fuck happened to me.
Right, because he's gone through he's like a proper lineage holder from Rinzai Zen. He's done through the full kind of mission, all that stuff. And then he fucks up and he goes, what just happened?
And so what blew me away was his honesty and his humility and his language. I mean, I never met a Zen teacher that dropped, literally 10 F-bombs in a paragraph.
I have to admit, I like that too.
And his genuine inquiry, which was what you guys think you know what's going on, so what the fuck's going on with me? I'm awake, but I'm doing all this stupid shadow shit. So you tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
And he was still inside of that inquiry because the same thing, sexual misconduct, had taken out his teacher.
Yeah.
He had resigned in protest and not become the head abbot because Edo Shimano Roshi couldn't keep his dick out of students.
Oh,
and he could not lie about it. And so Junpo left.
Suzuki Roshi, there's just been so many from the Zen tradition and the Tibetan tradition, slightly less from Theravada, but still plenty. And it's like, they're fucking up with money. They're there's one who was was it Suzuki Sensei, who was a kleptomaniac and he used to steal things?
I don't think it was Suzuki. I didn't. Yeah. I have to do that, but
Shinrazu Suzuki is it? The guy who read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Apparently a really enlightened Zen master, but used to just steal things. And, if his lawyers are out there, that's so I've heard. This is I don't know if that's true or not, but I've certainly seen the sexual misconduct and the power things and weird money stuff. And it's like, okay, so what was going on? So he had that inquiry. And I would love to give people a taste of a Zen master, because if you've just done John Kabat-Zinn mindfulness or your kind of slightly new age meditation, a Zen retreat's like you're lined up in straight lines on the, it's very sparse.
Just fuck up and sit down. Nobody cares what you're whining about. How you
sit down, shut up, sit down. And it's almost militaristic. I actually stopped doing it because to me, it's like I didn't need any more of that. It felt like I'm a bit yang anyway. Junpo would be dead quiet and everyone's silent. And then he'd feel people were a bit sleepy and he'd just say, wake up. I was like, whoa, this is a shock. I'm used to Thai temples, and there's a militaristic, because Zen was linked strongly to the Japanese military as well, like samurai Zen, they call it Rinzai, right? So it's got this fierceness to it, but its saving grace for me is also this sense of humor. Like Yoda's kind of like
it doesn't take itself, at least with Junpo. The form is rigid and it's held very loosely.
Yeah. It's an interesting paradox, isn't it? And in terms of the embodiment of it, on the one hand, very sitting and following formal posture, walking in very formal ways, it's like a pressure cooker being in one of those retreats.
Totally. I mean, and it's designed so, I've been doing Rinzai Zen now for 11, 12 years. So I can't go. I tried to go on a different retreat in a different lineage and almost lost my mind. Because it's people coming late, they shift and they scratch and they adjust, and they sigh and they slurp on their water. And, in Rinzai, as it's like the bell rings, you sit down, you have an itch, you don't scratch it. Your foot falls asleep, you don't adjust. You sit and you face whatever arises. And you look it right in the eye. The discomfort, the pain, the cold, the snot, the irritating dude next to you, whatever it is, you just face it. And that's been, for me personally, and it's not for everybody. I think everybody should experience it, but it really changed my life. It's allowed me to be in my life and never look away from what comes towards me.
Yeah, there is that fierceness of that sort of direct facing, and I remember this just really. I've been on a few Zen retreats of different kinds, but this Rinzai one I completed with Junpo. I did one that I actually left early and just went, this is not what I need right now, and one that I completed. And there was, what it took to get through it was was a huge effort of will. It's like climbing a mountain, like if you do one or two of those a year, it's like it's not a small undertaking, is it? For me. And then of course, what Junpo's added is somatic practices. So they're doing some movement and Qigong. I led a session actually on his retreat. He basically told me to lead a session. And it ruined my meditation for a day because I was planning it and worried how I would. You know what I mean? It was like, but I was like, I don't know if I was kind of honored, So I did a session there, and they were using some Qigong stuff and other sessions, and also the emotional element, right? So they're using these koans, these riddles, which people may have heard, the cliched, the sound of one hand clapping or whatever. And but also like looking at engaging with the emotional element, which isn't traditionally Japanese.
Not at all. What emotions? If you have emotional impediments, they just send you back to the Zendo to train harder.
Right. Just try harder.
Back to the Zendo. Back to the Zendo. Back to the Zendo. Yep. Yeah, and that's as you said earlier, that's the big flaw in Eastern thinking is they don't have the Western tools. And still to this day, they're biased against them. There's a bias in Eastern teachers of essentially deepen your insight. Practice harder.
Say that again.
Deepen your insight.
Deepen your insight, yeah.
So a deeper state experience, which we talked about earlier, will transmute whatever emotional challenges you're having. And the truth is it's just not true.
Yeah. And wasn't it the story of the Dalai Lama where Junpo was there and, there'd been some case of a Tibetan master abusing students or whatever. And the Dalai Lama said, it's so sad. His insight wasn't deep enough. And it's like, really? This guy's like the head of a lineage. He's practiced for 40 years. Surely there's a more intelligent approach to this.
Totally. And Junpo, it's interesting that for him, that has been a great koan because he, it's in the book, that story, but they were talking about this with a group of meditation masters with the Dalai Lama, like 50 people in all different lineages. And this Tibetan teacher that was in a sex scandal had come up and everybody was saying, basically like what a horrible thing horrible person he was and what he'd done. And Junpo raised his hand and was given the mic and said, Your Holiness, can I say something? He said, bullshit. What you're saying is bullshit. And he said, the Dalai Lama laughed, and he said, tell me more. And he said, this guy's, he's trained for 40 years. He did 3 3-year cave retreats. to
Yeah.
train with me personally. I've met this guy, and his insight is deep. His insight is deep enough. And he said the Dalai Lama looked at him and said, think that because your insight isn't deep enough.
There's no way out. There's no way out.
And initially, Junpo thought that's bullshit, right? It's a dodge. But now he's 75, and when you talk to him about it, he will maintain not that you can transform or transmute trauma, but that if your insight is deep enough, this is what he would say now. If your insight's deep enough, the first thing that arises out of emptiness is compassion. And he says nobody understands why, but when you're really deep in your practice, the first thing that you experience coming out of stillness is compassion for other human beings. Why? I don't know, I'll say. And he says, if your insight is really deep, acting selfishly and stupidly, it's just inconceivable.
Yeah.
And he said, in that sense, the Dalai Lama was correct.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's like I see my own personal flaws and some sense of my own shadow. And, it's actually an agreement I have with my co-trainer that I'm working with ongoing, is that I'm in therapeutic supervision. That's as an embodiment teacher, let alone as a meditation teacher. That is an agreement we have, that we're both in therapeutic supervision as a kind of ongoing thing. And, I look at, I've had a few warning shots over the bow, no like huge sex scandals or anything like that, but a few warning shots. And I've gone, you know what, maybe I don't want to make the mistakes of the last generation. I feel like it's like our generation maybe are getting a bit smarter about that. And the next one maybe even more so. We'll see. The kind of the sort of political awareness as well. It's like people idolizing these essentially dictatorial heads of undemocratic organizations. It's quite funny. Listen, we need to wrap up soon. Like one last thing to talk about in brief. The embodied path of an artist. So you're the first. We've had people that have written books on, but I see you, like most of them were teachers who wrote a book, whereas I see you as a writer. Is that fair to say? You're a writer.
I would, if I was to self-identify, a writer would come first.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry we haven't left much time for this, but what is, the embodied sense of that? Because most people might think of writing as a very cognitive thing. I'm guessing it's not for you.
No, I mean, writing for me, whether it was Junpo's biography or The Heart of Zen, which was nonfiction book that we wrote, or I just finished my fourth book, which is a novel, and looking for publishers. But all of those books, when I write, when I was writing Junpo's life, for instance, I was inside of his life. I was walking down the streets of San Francisco in 1964. I'm walking into bars. I'm looking at people in my mind's eye. I'm feeling things in my body, to the point when about maybe 6 months into working on that book, he was like, oh, I found this box of photographs of all these people in the places. Let me send them to you. And I was like, God, no, don't send them to me. You'll fuck everything up, because I've been walking through all those bars. I've been in your house. I've met your ex-wife. Like, it's all happened already. Like, I can't look at a picture now. So for me, the process of writing is deeply somatic in the sense that I go into my felt experience of writing a book. I'm in a scene and I'm describing what I see, what I smell, and what I feel. And so it has a very tactile element.
There's a visceral quality to that, I imagine. Yeah. I want to recommend your book to everyone. It is, you don't have to have a particular interest in Zen. It is a super fun read. We've missed out some really, let's tease people, we've missed out some juicy details. Available from Amazon, or I imagine you make more money at keithmartinsmith.com, right?
Amazon's fine, yeah.
Amazon's fine. Okay. I remember an interview between Stuart Davis and Junpo where he says, mondozen.com, and Stuart Davis says, that's Western Zen.
That's right.
So in the spirit of Western Zen, anything you want to tell us, flog us, sell us, publicize before we head off?
No, I mean, I would say if any of this resonates, I think people have really loved the book, A Heart Blown Open, Junpo's biography. It's a great book. It won a couple awards. We're making it into a movie. I'm really proud of it. And I would recommend, if people are interested in some of the things that we talked about today, which is states and shadows and trauma and the evolution of the mind, walking with one person through that path, I think it's a great read.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, and closing message about the body for our listeners. Any closing message?
Yeah, get in your fucking body. So right now, what's going on? Like, I'm sitting here, I can tell you what's going on from my toes to my balls all the way to the top of my head. So if you don't have a practice, get a practice.
I knew this, Keith.
Drive your body around for the rest of your life. It's a fucking waste of what you have.
I knew this would be fun. I think we probably shouldn't be allowed to spend too much time together unsupervised in the future. If they ever let me back into the United States, I visit. You're always welcome at ours in Brighton.
Absolutely. If I'm ever there, I will definitely be looking you up.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.